As the final months of World War II approached in Europe, American military strategists were confronted with a sobering reality. Despite the overwhelming Allied ground advances and the collapse of German industrial capacity, Nazi Germany still possessed aeronautical technology that was years ahead of anything the United States had in the air. The emergence of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first fully operational jet fighter in history, and the Arado R-234, the world's first jet-powered bomber, represented a sudden leap forward in aviation. These aircraft, sleek, fast, and radically engineered, had the potential to upend the balance of air power had they been deployed earlier or in greater numbers. Even at the tail end of the war, their existence posed a strategic question. What if other, even more advanced prototypes were still hidden in underground hangars, camouflaged test sites, or facilities the Allies had not yet reached? American commanders realized that Germany's aviation research must not only be neutralized, it had to be captured, understood, and integrated into America's own future. From this urgent mindset came Operation Lusty, an acronym for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. The operation was conceived not as a simple intelligence-gathering program, but as a race for technological dominance that began even before the guns had fallen silent. Allied intelligence officers had already been aware for months that German engineering in aerodynamics, jet propulsion, rocket technology, and swept-wing design was years ahead of its time. The first sightings of German jets in combat, accelerating far beyond the capabilities of even the P-51 Mustang, left U.S. pilots stunned. Rumors circulated across American airfields that new types of German weapons, including advanced radar-guided missiles, vertical takeoff aircraft, and long-range reconnaissance jets, had reached late testing stages. What had once been dismissed as exaggerated German propaganda began to sound plausible as more wreckage of jet engines and swept-wing prototypes was found across Western Europe. It was this threat, and the dawning realization of its implications for the post-war world, that led the U.S. Army Air Forces to form specialized teams whose sole mission was to locate, secure, and extract German aviation technology before it was destroyed by retreating German forces, captured by the Soviets, or lost to Allied bombing. These teams did not resemble conventional military units. They consisted of test pilots, engineers, mechanics, linguists, and intelligence officers with experience dismantling and reassembling aircraft. Many were second-generation Americans of German descent, capable of reading technical documents and interrogating German scientists with fluency. They traveled in small groups, often by jeep or captured German vehicles, equipped with Eisenhower-issued passes, granting them unrestricted access across Allied-controlled Europe. Their orders were broad: find everything, fly everything, ship everything. At the center of this operation stood Colonel Harold Hal Watson, a seasoned test pilot with an engineering background and a reputation for pushing aircraft to their limits without hesitation. He quickly became the driving force behind the retrieval of German jet aircraft. Watson understood that the only way to evaluate a jet fighter like the Me-262 was not to crate it up and send it home, but to fly it himself. He began assembling an elite cadre known informally as Watson's Wizards, men with the rare combination of technical expertise and nerves required to test captured enemy aircraft that might contain hidden explosive charges, sabotaged fuel lines, or structural weaknesses unknown to Allied mechanics. When Watson's team arrived in newly liberated zones, they often found abandoned Luftwaffe airfields with hangars full of partially destroyed aircraft. Some had been scorched to prevent capture, some stripped for parts, and others left intact as their former crews fled. Yet even wreckage offered valuable clues: fragments of turbojet blades, prototype avionics, exotic alloys used in engine housings. The closer Allied forces moved into Germany, the greater the pace of discovery became. Underground production sites carved into mountains, secret wind tunnels hidden in forests, and experimental airfields in remote districts all contained traces of advanced research. Test pilots, scientists, and mechanics, desperately fleeing the collapse of the Reich, carried documents, blueprints, or knowledge that American teams desperately needed. There was also the lingering threat that some of this technology could be transferred to Japan, which was still fighting in the Pacific. Evidence later confirmed that German engineers had already attempted to share jet engine designs with the Japanese military, hoping to preserve the legacy of German aviation innovation even as defeat loomed. The stakes were raised further by the presence of the Soviet Union. The Red Army's rapid advance through eastern Germany put many cutting-edge Luftwaffe research centers within their reach. Stalin's military intelligence agency was aggressively hunting the same aircraft, the same laboratories, and the same scientists. American and Soviet technical teams often arrived at facilities only hours apart. In some locations, U.S. troops reached a captured airfield in time to witness German engineers destroying engines and prototypes to keep them out of Allied hands. In others, they found Soviet officers already omnipresent, marking objects for seizure. The fear that Soviet engineers could leapfrog American designs with captured German knowledge added an undercurrent of geopolitical urgency to Operation Lusty. As the war edged closer to its conclusion in April 1945, news spread through the American command that the Me-262 was not the pinnacle of German aeronautical technology, only the one that had made it into combat. There were other engines, other shapes, other experimental prototypes whose existence had only been whispered about. Watson and his team realized they needed to move swiftly, even as the German front collapsed. Their most important leads pointed towards southern Germany, particularly around Augsburg and Lager-Lechfeld, locations tied to Messerschmitt's testing and assembly operations. The test pilots assigned to these facilities were considered the most knowledgeable in the world regarding jet aircraft performance. Before the month was over, harrowing encounters with booby-trapped cockpits, abandoned runways, and German pilots seeking surrender would define the beginning of a new chapter in aviation history. For American pilots, the idea that they would soon be flying enemy jets, craft far faster than anything the U.S. had ever built, seemed unbelievable. But Operation Lusty was about to transform that idea into reality. As the European war drew closer to collapse for Nazi Germany, the American intelligence community realized that time was becoming the most valuable resource they possessed. Every day that passed meant more research facilities destroyed, more scientists disappearing into Soviet custody, more aircraft sabotaged or burned on the ground, and more documents being torched in panic as the Reich fell apart. The race for German aviation technology was no longer theoretical. It was an urgent scramble. The Luftwaffe's jet fleet might have lost the war, but its engineering was decades ahead of what most Allied air planners had believed possible. American commanders understood that what they seized in the chaos of Germany's last days could define the future of their own aviation programs, for both military and civilian use. On April 22, 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces created a specialized, compartmentalized operation known as Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. It unified scattered intelligence units, crash investigation teams, technical interrogation officers, and field collectors under one coordinated mission. This new operation would target aircraft, engines, documents, flight test sites, radar installations, and the scientists who had designed them. While the collapse of German air power appeared absolute by April, the Americans understood that the technologies behind that power, jet propulsion, swept-wing design, high-altitude pressurization, airborne radar, and advanced metallurgy, were still invaluable assets. Leaving them to burn in ruins or fall intact into Soviet hands was completely unacceptable. To execute the hardware collection side of Operation Lusty, the Army Air Forces placed Colonel Harold Hal Watson in charge of what became known as Watson's Whizzers. Watson was an ideal choice, an engineer by training, a test pilot by profession, and a fluent interpreter of technical data. He understood not only how to fly cutting-edge aircraft, but also how to break them down, inspect them, and determine which pieces were worth bringing home. He was known for his near photographic memory when it came to aircraft systems, and for a personal confidence that made aircrews trust him even in the most chaotic conditions. Under him, a cadre of test pilots, maintenance specialists, and engineers was chosen. Many of these men were children of German immigrants, capable of speaking the language fluently, something that would prove invaluable when dealing with captured Luftwaffe personnel. Watson's Whizzers became an unusual sight across liberated Europe. Instead of combat units or armored columns, they traveled in jeeps and small aircraft, carrying notebooks, cameras, tools, and often nothing more than their Eisenhower passes. These passes authorized them to enter any Allied-controlled installation, seize materials, and request manpower or vehicles on the spot. The passes carried Eisenhower's own signature, meaning any hesitation from local commands vanished instantly. Engineers, pilots, and mechanics, escorted by the Whizzers, gained access to devastated Luftwaffe airfields, underground manufacturing sites, and partially bombed laboratories, sometimes while fighting still erupted in nearby streets. Their mission was simple in theory: locate intact examples of the aircraft on the American blacklist, the Me-262 fighter, the Arado 234 bomber, the Heinkel 219 night fighter, and several experimental prototypes, and organize their recovery. Finding intact aircraft proved to be more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The Luftwaffe, instructed to prevent valuable assets from falling into enemy hands, had detonated charges inside the cockpits of numerous Me-262s, destroyed engines with grenades, or ordered crews to crash-land their jets in remote areas. American tank units advancing into Bavaria and Württemberg often saw sleek German jets in the distance and instinctively opened fire, unaware that intelligence teams had hoped to capture them intact. Despite this, Watson's Whizzers managed to locate several Me-262s in conditions ranging from fully operational to barely repairable. What they needed now were the same technicians who had built and maintained the aircraft. In late April 1945, Watson personally traveled to Augsburg, a shattered city where Messerschmitt's main test facilities had once operated. Seeking the company's chief test pilot, Karl Bauer, he walked directly into the ruined facility with nothing but his Eisenhower pass and complete confidence. Bauer, realizing the war was effectively over and that cooperation with the Americans offered safety and stability in a collapsing nation, agreed almost immediately to assist. Through him, Watson secured the cooperation of more than 20 Messerschmitt mechanics, technicians, and test pilots. These men were not motivated by ideology. They wanted food, shelter, protection from the Soviets, and a chance to earn a small wage in the ruins of post-war Germany. With their help, the Americans finally had the expertise needed to make damaged Me-262s flyable again. But cooperation came with risks. The Luftwaffe had installed booby traps in several aircraft, including explosive charges wired beneath pilot seats and inside control panels, designed to kill whoever attempted to fly the jets after capture. Mechanics and whizzers worked slowly and methodically, examining wiring connections, checking ammunition trays, and inspecting fuel systems for sabotage. Some jets were discovered with time-delayed charges or grenades hidden beneath removable panels. The presence of German technicians who knew the aircraft intimately was essential to preventing fatal accidents. After weeks of repair work and test runs, the whizzers finally had a small fleet of operable Me-262s ready to fly. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, a lone German Me-262 approached the American-held field at Lechfeld. Instead of attacking, it rocked its wings, lowered gear, and landed. The pilot, unwilling to surrender to approaching Soviet units, chose an American airfield as the safest option. The aircraft he delivered became the first fully operational jet fighter captured intact by U.S. forces. This sudden windfall energized Operation Lusty. Instead of relying solely on scavenging wrecks or repairing bomb-damaged fighters, the Americans now had proof that German pilots themselves might deliver useful hardware directly into Allied hands. Over the following days, more aircraft appeared or were seized intact at airfields where the whizzers had established a presence. Each Luftwaffe jet was quickly repainted with American markings, stars and bars replacing the Balkenkreuz, swastikas painted over, ensuring that Allied fighters wouldn't mistake them for hostile aircraft during ferry flights. These jets would not remain in Europe. The next challenge for Watson's whizzers was transporting them back across the Atlantic without damage. The British offered the aircraft carrier HMS Reaper for the job, and the whizzers began ferrying captured aircraft from German airfields to the port at Cherbourg, France. Once there, German jets, bombers, and experimental prototypes were sealed in protective coverings and carefully hoisted onto the carrier's deck. The loading operation was slow, dangerous, and delicate. Wing spars were fragile, jet engines were susceptible to salt corrosion, and the deck could only accommodate a certain number of aircraft on each voyage. But by the end of the operation, dozens of technologically significant airframes were safely on board. When the HMS Reaper finally sailed for the United States, it carried a trove of aeronautical treasures that would shape American aviation for decades. The Me-262, the Arado 234, and other captured aircraft offered direct lessons in high-speed aerodynamics, jet propulsion, swept wing performance, and fuel-efficient engine design. As soon as the aircraft arrived in the U.S., engineers and test pilots began studying them, reporting on their strengths and weaknesses, and incorporating their innovations into America's next generation of jet fighters. As the first shipments of captured German aircraft arrived in France and England, the U.S. Army Air Forces quickly realized that they had gained something far more valuable than a collection of enemy machines. They had acquired the most advanced aviation secrets ever developed in wartime Europe. Ranging from swept-wing theory to turbojet metallurgy, high-speed aerodynamics, ejection seat engineering, radar-guided gun sights, and even exotic fuels. Operation Lusty had begun as an intelligence mission, but by mid-1945, it was transforming into a full-scale race to decode the future of aerial warfare. Everything the Germans had built, from the Me-262 jet fighter to the AR-234 jet bomber to prototypes that had never even flown, was suddenly within reach of American test pilots who were preparing to fly these machines against the very nation that had created them. But before any flights could happen, teams of mechanics and engineers had to rebuild these aircraft under wartime conditions, using unfamiliar German tools. Manuals written in precise technical vocabulary and engines unlike anything produced in the United States. Simply getting the jets to run again required a blend of ingenuity, improvisation, and patience. At Wright Field in Ohio, the epicenter of American aviation testing, hangars once filled with Republic P-47s and B-25 Mitchells were now crowded with Me-262 fuselages, BMW 003 engines, and crates of German components. Each aircraft arrived partially disassembled, its systems damaged by war, sabotage, or improper handling. Some had holes blown through their wings, others had missing panels, shattered canopy glass, or burned wiring. But the mechanics chosen for Operation Lusty were among the most skilled in the U.S. Army Air Forces, working from translated manuals, and sometimes reverse engineering entire systems without written documentation. They slowly brought the jets back to life. The Me-262's Jumo 004 engines were notoriously fragile. Their turbine blades wore out after barely 20 hours of flight time. But American ground crews treated the engines as delicate scientific instruments rather than standard power plants. Replacement parts were machined by hand. Fuel mixtures were tested repeatedly. Engineers studied the metallurgy of German alloys, often discovering techniques far ahead of U.S. industry. The first time an American pilot strapped into a restored Me-262 at Wright Field, even seasoned observers fell silent. The jet's cockpit was cramped, filled with unfamiliar gauges, and built around a German pilot's ergonomic expectations. Handles shaped differently, switches placed in odd patterns, safety systems that reflected a different philosophy of combat flight. American test pilots like Fred Borsodi, Chuck Yeager, Walter Peters, Bob Hoover, and Lieutenant Colonel Wilgen, Harold Watson were given only minimal instruction before attempting to fly the world's fastest operational jet. Their first challenge wasn't the aircraft's speed. It was simply getting off the ground without destroying the engines. The Me-262's twin turbojets demanded a slow, careful throttle-up sequence. Too fast, and the hot section blades would shatter. Too slow, and the aircraft risked starvation or compressor stall. American pilots described the engine response as like waking a sleeping dragon. One wrong move, and it bites. When the first American-piloted Me-262 accelerated down the runway at Wright Field, the sound was unlike anything heard in the U.S. before. Instead of the familiar roar of a piston engine, the aircraft emitted a smooth, high-pitched shriek like compressed air escaping a giant valve. As the wheels left the ground, the silence inside the cockpit struck pilots immediately. No vibration, no rumbling pistons, only the slipstream and the whistle of the turbines. And then came the speed. For test pilots accustomed to flying P-51s at around 400 miles per hour, watching the airspeed needle climb past 500, then 520, 540, 560 miles per hour felt like passing through the boundary between eras. They were flying faster than any American aircraft could sustain in level flight. They were experiencing the future. Pilots soon discovered that the Me-262 was both revolutionary and dangerously unforgiving. Its swept wings produced unfamiliar stall behavior. Its acceleration was sluggish at low speeds, creating a vulnerable window during takeoff and landing. And its engines, though powerful, spooled up so slowly that evasive maneuvers were nearly impossible if caught off guard. But in level flight at altitude, the aircraft was astonishingly smooth. American pilots frequently compared the experience to riding on rails. stable, effortless, with almost no vibration. In mock dogfights, the Me-262 could run circles around anything the Americans had, performing extended high-speed dives without fear of engine overspeed, outrunning the fastest prop fighters with ease. But its handling revealed every flaw that German engineers had been forced to accept due to resource shortages, rushed production, and the limitations of early jet technology. The nose wheel sometimes shuddered. The cockpit visibility was narrower than American designs preferred, and the engine mounts vibrated dangerously at higher RPM. The test flights were not limited to the Me-262. American pilots also flew the Arado R-234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber, along with the Heinkel-Hay 162 Volksjäger, the emergency production fighter built in mere weeks during the collapse of the Reich. Flying the R-234 shocked American crews. The aircraft accelerated quickly, cruised at high altitude with ease, and incorporated an advanced autopilot system far superior to many American equivalents. Even its cockpit layout, with clean instrument grouping, advanced bomb sights, and a streamlined design, reflected an engineering philosophy oriented towards speed and efficiency. Meanwhile, the HE-162 presented the opposite experience: rushed, unstable, sometimes terrifying. It was fast, agile, and beautifully streamlined, but its construction quality varied wildly, and its singly turbojet sat directly above the cockpit canopy, showering the pilot in engine heat and vibration. Every flight added new data to the mountain of intelligence Operation Lusty was gathering. Engineers documented the jet's aerodynamics, engine thrust curves, stress limits, and performance envelopes. They took apart landing gear mechanisms, hydraulic systems, cockpit designs, and fuel injection components. And as the test program expanded, American pilots grew increasingly aware of one startling truth. Had Germany produced these aircraft earlier, in larger numbers, and with stable fuel supplies, the air war over Europe might have looked dramatically different. The Me-262, in particular, was recognized as a weapon that could have devastated Allied bomber formations. But its development had been delayed by political interference, internal sabotage, fuel shortages, and Adolf Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be converted into a fast bomber, a decision that crippled its deployment timeline. What mattered now, however, wasn't fear of what could have happened. What mattered was what the United States could learn from these machines. Every test flight became a lesson in future warfare. Every captured engine became a blueprint for the next generation of American jets. The pilots who flew them described a profound sense of crossing a threshold, leaving behind the era of propellers and stepping into the jet age with technologies that were only months earlier guarded behind the most secret doors of Nazi Germany. Operation Lusty had begun as a mission to gather intelligence. By the middle of 1945, it had become an unprecedented crash course in the future of flight, a future the Americans now intended to master. As the first batches of captured German aircraft made their way out of Europe under Operation Lusty, the American teams began to confront a new reality. The program had grown so large and the stakes so high that the U.S. military had to reorganize its handling of the captured technology. What had started as small groups of technical officers searching hangars and Luftwaffe bases for anything valuable was now becoming a full logistical chain, stretching from collapsing German factories to specialized evaluation centers in the United States. The race intensified even further because the Soviets, moving rapidly through Eastern Germany and Silesia, had begun their own version of this hunt, seizing entire design bureaus, production lines, and even German engineers. Every hour mattered. If the Americans wanted Germany's most advanced jets, rockets, radar sets, and secret prototypes, They had to move quickly, decisively, and often without waiting for bureaucratic approval. The air war had ended, but something like a shadow war had begun. In towns that only weeks earlier had been under Nazi rule, American officers negotiated with former Luftwaffe personnel, offered safety to engineers in exchange for access to prototypes, and, in some cases, raced Soviet units to the same airfields. Many of the German technicians, aware that their lives under Soviet control would be very different from what the Americans offered, volunteered information freely. Others concealed data or attempted escape, still clinging to the idea that some new German government might need their knowledge. Operation Lusty teams had to navigate this human landscape carefully. They interviewed designers who had worked on the Messerschmitt Me-262, the Arado 234 Blitz bomber, the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, and experimental paper projects that never reached combat but showed the extreme direction of late-war German aviation. Some were cooperative, others remained hostile, refusing to believe the war was lost, even as Allied troops walked through their factories. Amid this chaotic search, American pilots were preparing to fly the captured jets not just as samples, but as operational aircraft meant to unlock the secrets of German aerodynamics. Flying a propeller-driven fighter through an occupied German airfield in 1945 was one thing. Strapping into an unfamiliar jet built by a defeated enemy under wartime conditions was something else entirely. The Me-262s recovered by Operation Lusty teams varied wildly in condition. Some had been bomb damaged and then hastily repaired during the final weeks of the war. Others were missing removable panels, instruments, or essential flight controls. A few had been sabotaged by German ground crews, who added sand to the engines or left hydraulic lines purposely severed. Every Me-262 had to be disassembled, inventoried, inspected for traps, and rebuilt before any American pilot could so much as taxi it across a runway. The jet engines themselves, Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets, were notoriously temperamental, often overheating or breaking turbine blades if the throttle was advanced too eagerly. German pilots had learned this through bitter experience. American pilots would now learn it directly from captured documentation or from former Luftwaffe mechanics who were willing to explain the quirks of the engines. Once reassembled, the Me-262s were gathered at staging bases in Germany, such as Lechfeld and Melun. There, American test pilots prepared for the flights that would define the next era of aviation. The instructions were sparse. Manuals were sometimes incomplete. Instruments were labeled in German. The Luftwaffe's own procedures for takeoff, long, shallow acceleration to avoid compressor stalls, seemed risky and counterintuitive to pilots used to the responsiveness of radial engines. But gradually, the Americans grew familiar with the aircraft's personality: slow throttle response, long takeoff roll, and sudden bursts of acceleration once the jet spooled properly. They discovered that the Me-262 was stable at high speed, but dangerous at low speed, particularly during landings, where the slightest error could cause the engines to flame out. Yet once airborne, the aircraft revealed the future: smooth handling, high climb rates, and astonishing speed that made all propeller aircraft seem instantly outdated. These early flights were not simple demonstrations. They were data-gathering missions meant to dissect every performance element: stall behavior, structural stress under high-speed turns, engine reliability across altitude ranges, and aerodynamic stability during dives exceeding 500 miles per hour. The Americans pushed the Me-262 in ways the Luftwaffe never had the luxury to test, performing controlled trials under safe conditions, recording measurements with onboard instruments, and analyzing each flight report. Their findings went straight to American aircraft manufacturers, many of whom already had jet prototypes, but lacked real-world data about operational jet fighters. For U.S. aviation, it was a moment of acceleration, not just in technology, but in doctrine. The Me-262 had shown that jet fighters would dominate the skies. Now, American engineers needed to master the science quickly, before the Soviets developed their own. Meanwhile, Operation Lusty teams continued pushing deeper into the remains of the Luftwaffe's infrastructure. They discovered underground factories, half-finished prototypes hidden in forest hangars, and experimental wind tunnels with data that had never been transmitted to Berlin. In southern Germany, they found remnants of the Horten HO-229 flying wing, a radical jet-powered aircraft that looked like a spacecraft from another era. In northern Germany, they captured components of the TA-183, a swept-wing fighter that would later influence the Soviet MiG-15. Every find reshaped the post-war aviation race. American intelligence officers were stunned by the quantity and sophistication of Germany's late-war designs. Much of this technology had been developed too late to save the Third Reich, but it would shape the next decade of global air power. The program's escalation created new challenges. Jets needed to be shipped to the United States for extended testing, but training crews to disassemble and crate them was a slow process. Many jets were fragile, with thin metal skins and delicate internal fuel lines. A careless lift by a crane could deform a fuselage. Worse, some jets had fuel tanks coated with volatile wartime sealants that became flammable once exposed to air. Several nearly ignited during preparation. Still, the teams persisted, often working around the clock to prepare each aircraft. In some cases, they had to rebuild entire nose assemblies or remanufacture missing structural pieces. The urgency was constant. The faster jets arrived in America, the sooner American aircraft designers could use their data to leap ahead of Soviet projects. To organize the effort, the U.S. created dedicated groups such as the Air Technical Service Command and the Wright Field Air Documents Division, which sorted through mountains of German technical papers. These documents, thousands of pages of wind tunnel results, engine diagrams, and prototype drawings, were flown to the United States aboard military transports, where engineers analyzed them almost immediately. Every paper, every blueprint, every recovered aircraft became part of an enormous post-war collaboration among the Army Air Forces, NACA, the predecessor to NASA, and major defense contractors. The flow of information moved so quickly that within a year, American engineers were designing jets with swept wings, pressurized cockpits, and improved turbojets that incorporated both American innovation and German aerodynamic discoveries. What made Operation Lusty so extraordinary was not only the breadth of the technology captured, but the speed at which the Americans adapted and absorbed it. In just months, they transformed battlefield salvage operations into a full-fledged scientific program that influenced the next generation of fighters. Without Lusty, American jet development would have advanced, but much more slowly and with far less understanding of the limits and dangers of early jet propulsion. The program brought America directly into the jet age, not theoretically, but through direct experience in the cockpit. Pilots flying enemy aircraft and engineers learning from the wreckage of German laboratories. By the end of 1945, the first captured jets had already arrived in the United States, flown across the Atlantic by the very pilots who had risked their lives in Germany. These men became the bridge between wartime aviation and the coming Cold War race for speed and altitude. Their work and the aircraft they delivered would soon become the foundation of new jet fighters, new tactics, and an entirely new era of American air power. By the late summer of 1945, Operation Lusty had turned into one of the most extraordinary intelligence warehouses in military history. What had started as a scramble to seize scattered documents, half-finished prototypes, and terrified Luftwaffe mechanics had become a massive air bridge of German engineering, flowing straight into American hands. The Me-262s that arrived in crates or flew under their own power across French airfields were only the beginning. American personnel working through the ruins of Bavarian factories discovered jet engines in varying states of completion. Some pristine, some charred, many looking as though they had been rushed through construction during the final weeks of the war. They found rocket interceptors like the Me-163, bizarre swept-wing blueprints that looked like science fiction, experimental tailless aircraft, and folders stuffed with aerodynamic tables so advanced that U.S. engineers stared at them with disbelief. Every time a new discovery was made, officers immediately asked the same question: can it be flown? Can it be shipped? And can it teach us something? The Me-262s remained the crown jewels. For months after VE Day, American pilots continued to fly them, logging hours in both controlled test environments and improvised airfields. Many of these flights were not simply for curiosity. The United States wanted to know how these jets would compare to the new fighters already being built at home: early P-80 Shooting Stars, prototypes of swept-wing research aircraft, and even speculative designs that would later form the skeleton of America's first supersonic planes. By flying the Me-262 directly against American fighters, test pilots could determine exactly where its strengths outweighed its weaknesses. The conclusions were consistent. At high speed, the Me-262 was unmatched. At low speed, it was fragile, slow to accelerate, and dangerously vulnerable. But speed, raw, unrestrained, almost unreal speed, was where the future lay. And in this sense, the Me-262 had arrived decades early. Even after dozens of hours of jet-to-jet comparisons, the Americans kept pushing the boundaries of what the captured German jets could do. Some pilots experimented with extreme climb tests, noting the 262's sluggish engine response. Others practiced simulated combat engagements so aggressive that ground crews begged them to stop before they tore apart the aging Jumo engines. More than once, a pilot returned with a dead engine after compressor failure, gliding the wounded jet back to the runway with a calm that belied the danger he had just survived. Every failure, every accident, every torn turbine blade was logged, photographed, analyzed, and added to a rapidly expanding database that American engineers pored over night and day. These failures were not setbacks. They were priceless lessons telling the U.S. what not to do when designing its own next-generation aircraft. Meanwhile, the text and paper side of Operation Lusty, often overshadowed by the dramatic flights, proved equally transformative. Storage facilities in Europe filled with documents, engineering manuals, wind tunnel data, fuel formulas, metallurgy notes, design mock-ups, and captured blueprints for aircraft that had never flown. Teams of interpreters and aeronautical engineers worked in shifts, translating and indexing this mountain of material. The Germans had cataloged almost everything they had invented during the war, sometimes down to the smallest bolt dimension. Many of the documents horrified the Americans with their detail, not because they were sinister, but because they revealed that the Luftwaffe had been on the brink of fielding aircraft that would have changed air combat forever. High-altitude rocket interceptors capable of climbing above bomber formations in under 2 minutes. ramjet-powered research prototypes designed for speeds approaching Mach 1, and swept-wing fighter concepts, startlingly similar to designs the U.S. itself would not build for years. From the perspective of the pilots who flew the captured jets, however, the emotional experience was far simpler. They knew they were participating in something historic, something that blurred the line between enemy technology and the future of American aviation. Many spoke afterward of the surreal sensation of climbing into a cockpit that had, only weeks earlier, been used to shoot down American bombers. They recalled seeing bullet holes patched crudely in the fuselage, the German stencils still visible under the fresh U.S. identification numbers, and the odd mix of pride and melancholy that came from mastering a machine that had terrified Allied pilots for years. Some pilots kept journals describing the way the Me-262 felt like a bird stretching its wings after centuries of confinement, surging forward with an energy fundamentally different from propeller aircraft. Others admitted that flying it gave them a strange sense of connection, however brief, to the German aces whose logbooks had been found stuffed in the cockpit map holders. As the months went on, the U.S. began transporting the most valuable aircraft back to America. They were brought to Wright Field in Ohio, Freeman Field in Indiana, and various naval aviation testing centers. There, American engineers continued dismantling, studying, and flying these jets for years after the war. Some Me-262s were flown into the early 1950s, long after their combat relevance had faded, because the data they produced never stopped being useful. As American jet fighters grew faster, sleeker, and more reliable, the influence of captured German research remained embedded within the DNA of each new design. Swept wings, high-temperature alloys, axial flow turbines, and radar-integrated targeting systems all matured more rapidly because Operation Lusty had accelerated American understanding by years, perhaps decades. At the same time, the Cold War was beginning. The United States realized that the Soviets were making their own aggressive push to capture German scientists and equipment. In the chaos of occupied Germany, teams from both countries sometimes arrived at the same airfields or factories within days of each other. In some cases, Americans intentionally moved Me-262s and related engines out of zones about to be turned over to Soviet control. The fear was not that the Soviets would replicate German technology. They certainly would, but that they might leapfrog the United States entirely if they secured the right engineers and documentation. Thus, Operation Lusty became not only a treasure hunt against a defeated enemy, but a race against an emerging rival. By the time the program ended, more than 16,000 tons of documents, hundreds of aircraft, and countless pieces of experimental technology had been secured. Operation Lusty, a name that to modern ears might sound jokingly casual, was in reality one of the most consequential intelligence missions in aviation history. Its impact did not produce headlines at the time. Much of the material remained classified for decades, but the fingerprints of the operation could be seen everywhere the American aviation industry moved in the late 1940s and 1950s. The first generation of U.S. jet fighters bore design influences from Luftwaffe research facilities. Early swept-wing pioneers, like the North American F-86 and Soviet MiG-15, arch-rivals of the Korean War, both owed part of their lineage to German aerodynamic discoveries. Radar-guided intercept strategies, jet engine cooling methods, and even high-speed wind tunnel data found in German laboratories guided both American and Soviet design doctrine. Looking back, the most astonishing part of Operation Lusty was not that American pilots flew captured Nazi jets. It was that they flew them boldly, repeatedly, and often recklessly, pushing aircraft built by their former enemies to their absolute limits. In doing so, they helped ensure that the United States entered the jet age not as a hesitant newcomer, but as a global leader. The very technology designed to protect Hitler's crumbling Reich instead became the foundation for American air power in the Cold War and beyond. The Me-262, once a symbol of German technological superiority, became a stepping stone to something far greater, an American aviation revolution built, ironically, with the help of the enemy's most advanced creations.